colonization society is, what does that sound like? Like, just take a guess. I won't make fun of you too much.
A group of old men who like talking about history.
Okay, something kind of uninteresting, lame, boring. This is kind of an eye-opening movement here. This was an effort by some people that say blacks and whites cannot live together. And so what the American Colonization Society is going to do is pay to have black people living in the United States sent back to Africa. Because it's just basically transporting blacks back to Africa. And that was the sole goal of this American Colonization Society. It was founded in the year 1817. And they did establish a colony in West Africa. Today, the country is known as Liberia. And the capital of Liberia is Monrovia. Who was the president of the United States in 1817? When was the American Colonization Society created? When James Monroe was president. And so they named the city after James Monroe, Monrovia, and Liberia, like liberty, freedom. So they felt like they were giving these people, these former slaves, freedom with the capital city of Monrovia. And about some 15,000 freed blacks were transported there. This was not sending slaves. They're not sending slaves. Slaves were still property of people. This was freed blacks. And about 15,000 of these freed blacks were transported there over about a period of 4 decades. Put yourself in these free blacks' position. Would you like to go? I mean, most of them had no wish to go to live in a strange part of the world, a place where they were born in America. They were Americans. They didn't speak the language. They didn't have the cultures. These free blacks that were being sent there were totally Americanized, and now they're being sent to a place where they don't know anyone, and they really were not interested in doing that. They wanted to stay in the United States. So, where their home was, where their friends were, where their families were, even if life was not great for them, at least they had some community which helped them out. So, the colonization idea appealed to a lot of anti-slavery people, including Abraham Lincoln. He liked this idea of separating until the time of the Civil War, when he abandoned this idea of colonization of Africa. Okay? But we have been talking about some reforms. And what these reforms in American government all spawn out of what movement? What happened that created these reforms? It was a religious movement. The Second Great Awakening. And when you see these reforms in education and prison reforms and abolitionism, the idea that individuals, that humans can make a difference. That's one of the things that has spawned out of this Second Great Awakening movement. William Lloyd Garrison is a radical abolitionist. What makes him radical? Because he's one gnarly dude? Radical? What makes him radical, an abolitionist, as opposed to just a regular old plain abolitionist that wants to get rid of slavery? What makes it? What ideas does he have that makes it radical? Okay, well, if you're just a plain old abolitionist, you definitely want to see slavery come to an end. William Lloyd Garrison says slavery should end immediately, 100% end it right now, not gradually, not over time, not giving compensation to the people who are losing their property. A lot of abolitionists were like that. Like, hey, let's just end it over time, or let's end it gradually, or, yeah, we can end it, but we're going to compensate the slave owners for losing their property. William Lloyd Garrison says this is immoral, this is wrong, and it should end right now. Period. No compensation, no time, just boom, you're free immediately. Okay? And not a lot of people agreed with him. Okay? He published a newspaper called The Liberator, and it was pretty militant in his anti-slavery views. And he published it out of Boston, Massachusetts. And he's a true child of the, a true spiritual child of the Second Great Awakening. But other people were drawn to William Lloyd Garrison. No, ma'am. They were drawn to William Lloyd Garrison because of his radical ideas and his beliefs. Such people like Sojourner Truth. You ever heard of her? Sojourner Truth. She was a freed black woman who lived in New York and fought tirelessly for black emancipation and women's rights. She was one of the first black leaders to take seriously the notion of recolonization in Africa. She had a very deep, resonating voice and a religious passion with which she condemned what she called the sin of slavery. But she was a former slave. But by far the greatest of all the black abolitionists was any guesses?
Is it a woman?
It is a man. He's from Maryland. Frederick Douglass is correct. Very good. He's by far the greatest of the black abolitionists because he did it for such a vast period of time. Here's him as a young man. And here's him as an old man. And, he escaped from bondage, from slavery in 1838 at the age of 21. And he was in Maryland, so he was not far from the North anyway, from free states, and fled that way. And when he was discovered by abolitionists in the 1840s, he gave an impromptu speech at an anti-slavery meeting in Massachusetts. He just kind of stood up and began to speak very eloquently about the evils of slavery. He was an uneducated man, self-educated, learned everything on his own. And thereafter, he was given encouragement by these radical abolitionists to, speak widely for the cause, even though the threats of beatings and threats against his life were always prevalent, and beatings themselves did happen. He was willing to stand up for what he believed in, and we know a lot about this because he published a book about himself in 1845, pre-Civil War. It's an autobiography called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And what it does is it depicts his remarkable origins, about where he came from, as the son of a black slave woman and a white father. He had a white father. His struggle, getting educated, learning to read and write, and then eventually how he escapes into the North. It's an autobiography. So Douglass was not like William Lloyd Garrison, in that William Lloyd Garrison was very radical. Frederick Douglass was more practical. Okay, he understood that it was not going to be an immediate change that was going to happen right now. So, Garrison often appeared to be interested in more of his own righteousness than the actual substance of the evils of slavery. So, Frederick Douglass was and remains a very staunch abolitionist and stood up for the rights of blacks throughout American history throughout his entire life. Okay, So questions on Frederick or Sojourner. Okay, we'll talk more about abolitionist movement. Those are just kind of some people who take the ideas of the Second Great Awakening and their own experience and apply them to their own lives. All right. Okay. All right. Moving right along. We're going to look back into the politics a little bit more, the governmental aspect as opposed to society of this time period, which is the 1840s. The 1840s were a period of vast change for America, with the idea that we need to move westward, annex Texas, claim California for our own, no matter what. All the while, the status of slavery is up for question, whether it'll be allowed in these new territories which we're expanding into and claimed. So the 1840s are a pretty volatile time in American history. Enter new President of the United States, William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison is known for a lot of things. His nickname was Tippecanoe. Where did he get that nickname? The Battle of Tippecanoe, where during the War of 1812, where he gained fame and notoriety for his ability to fight off the Shawnee Indians in the areas of Ohio and Indiana. You guys know anything about William Henry Harrison as president? He died. Yeah, about a month into his presidency. It's kind of an interesting story. They say when he gave his inaugural address, it was a cold, rainy January day in Washington, and he did not wear an overcoat and a hat, and he caught pneumonia and died a month later. He gave a very long speech also. But he dies of pneumonia very soon into his presidency, only 4 weeks after taking his oath, which is by far the shortest administration in American history, which followed by, and his death was followed by the longest inaugural address in American history. It was like insanely long, like 8,400 words long, very long. No wonder he caught pneumonia, right? So, old Tippecanoe's gone. And so we turn to his running mate, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So who we turn to? John Tyler. Okay. John Tyler is the Tyler 2 part of that Whig ticket, as they're both part of, as he was this is a Whig. They were members of the Whig party. He was really an afterthought. They only chose John Tyler on the tickets because he was a Virginian, and Virginia was a large state, and they could get a lot of electoral college votes there. They didn't really even agree. They didn't really even have the same ideas on the policies. But John Tyler is now president of the United States, 4 months into, or 4 weeks into Harrison's presidency. So, Tyler himself was tall. He's about 6 feet tall, slender, had blue eyes. He was a Virginia gentleman of the old school. Now, when we say he's old school in 1840, that's really old school, right? So, pretty stubborn. He was a senator. He's kind of like a lone wolf in politics. He never really belonged anywhere. They called him his accidency. That was his nickname, his accidency. You know how like you would say to the king, your majesty, his majesty? They called him his accidency. Because the only reason he became in power is, because Harrison died. Because John Tyler was kind of a lone wolf and didn't really agree with anything that the Whig Party really stood for, he did not receive renomination. Like when it was time for the re-election to come around, they chose somebody else to run for them. This is a guy that had been president for 4 years. They chose not to not to reelect or even have him run for president. So kind of a president of consequence. It's pretty bad when you don't even get selected by your own party to run for election when you could win. He could have literally ran for 2 more elections and been president for 8 more years in addition to the 4 he'd already served, because that wasn't his election. Okay? But the 1830s and 40s also see a movement and a push for expansion into the West. And during the years since Texas had become its own country, which it did, the Texas Republic, Texas had wanted to become a state ever since. And it had been a pretty precarious 8 years because Mexico refused to recognize that Texas was its own country. Mexico simply considered Texas an area in rebellion. And all those treaties that they forced Santa Anna to sign after the Battle of San Jacinto, those were invalid. He signed them at gunpoint. So those don't even count. So it puts America in a kind of awkward position because, sure, we like this new land. Texas is great land. It's wonderful. But what would happen if it became a new state? That's right. Slavery gets expanded into new states. Slavery would become, slave states would gain another state in the Senate. All the representatives from Texas would probably be pro-slavery. And so it upsets the balance of power in Congress. So America is not exactly open to the idea of having Texas become a state immediately. That's why it takes 8 years. But Texas is, still having to fight off Mexico because Mexico still says Texas is a part of Mexico. And so they're really kind of in a constant battle with Mexico all during this time. And America is just kind of like watching it, kind of keeping their hands off. But Texas needs help. So Texas is driven into open negotiations with countries like Britain and France because Texas claimed it was its own country. Britain was extremely interested in an independent Texas. They wanted to see Texas as its own country. Such a state like Texas, or such a republic as Texas, would put a check on America's southward expansion and lessen the power of America. Texas is really, really big, guys. It's really big. Okay? America is put into an awkward position with Texas, and dangers with when Texas begins to do negotiations with European powers, because that means that European powers are getting involved in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. Is that okay with America? Is there any kind of rule on the books that has to do with European powers getting involved in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere? The Monroe Doctrine. So this is one of the instances where where foreign countries are challenging America in the Monroe Doctrine. So it really forces America's hand to get involved. All right? And then you enter President James K. Polk in 1844. And Texas becomes the leading campaign issue for the presidential campaign of 1844. James K. Polk was a Democrat cut from the cloth of Andrew Jackson. And the Whigs, who had John Tyler, chose to not run John Tyler and ran Henry Clay. Henry Clay he runs for president like 50 times. He never wins. Never once. So James K. Polk defeats Henry Clay. And he is very eager to get involved in the annexation of Texas. Tyler actually does deserve a lot of the credit for America acquiring Texas. But James K. Polk was just outright open about it. He's like, look, I'm from Tennessee. I own slaves. I don't care if slavery expands. I want Texas. And we're going to do it. And he wanted to see America become a slave power, to have slavery expanded. And so he therefore arranged for the annexation of Texas by a joint resolution. Only required a simple majority. And see, now Texas is a little different because it's not it's not a territory. You know what I'm saying? Like, our Constitution set up so that when we have territory, like, the Northwest Territory, whenever that area reaches a certain amount of votes, population, they can create a constitution and then they can just become a state. Well, Texas is not an American territory. Texas is the country of Texas. It's its own country. So it went a little bit differently, and it was just simply a simple majority is all it needed in 1845, which allowed for Texas to be the 28th state of the United States. Okay? All right, so James K. Polk, he gets Texas. He's not done. He wants to expand even further. And the so-called Oregon country was an enormous wilderness which sprawled magnificently throughout the northwest part of the United States, west of the Rocky Mountains and north of California, all the way up to this line right here. This is a line of latitude called 5440. It goes all the way up to Alaska, the southern tip of Alaska, which at that time was owned by Russia. Okay, so it goes all the way to Russia. But if you recall, when John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State, he negotiated a treaty here, which basically said that we're going to share this territory. It's going to be shared. We like to share. Americans, typically sharing is not in our nature. Okay? And James K. Polk did not like the idea of sharing either. He said, we're going to get all of it. All of it. And during his presidential campaign, James K. Polk's campaign slogan, 5440 or fight. Meaning we are going to take all of this land up to the 5440 line of latitude, or we're going to war with England over this land. It's a pretty strong claim. He wins a presidential election with a war threat. It's a little bit different time for America in the 1840s. So, I mean, politicians make campaign promises. 5440 or fight. How about 49 and we don't fight? That's it. That's what happens. This is the actual present-day boundary between the United States and what is Canada. This remained a British territory, and this remained America. Right? The 49th parallel. So, it's no longer jointly occupied. We have ours, you have yours. And that is what gets negotiated during James K. Polk's presidency in 1846 with what is now called the Treaty of 1846. So I guess 5440 or fight. How about, whatever. Just give us some land. And we won't fight. all of this, the expansion to California, claiming the Oregon Territory, America becomes a coast-to-coast nation, from Pacific Ocean to Atlantic Ocean. All of this has to do with the idea of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny. And we will talk about manifest destiny Thursday.